A deafening boom shook the entire neighborhood. A jet of gas shot out of the ground like a geyser, hissing violently as it escaped into the air. The jackhammer clattered to the ground, and the woman holding it stumbled backward, her face frozen in horror. The smell of rotten eggs filled the air, a sign of a dangerous gas leak. People screamed. Windows rattled. Car alarms blared. Birds scattered from the trees. The earth itself seemed to groan as the cracked pavement hissed with more gas leaking into the open air. "Everyone get back!" a man shouted. "Someone call 911. The woman, Karen, stood there, shaking as her grand plan to fix the neighborhood went terribly, terribly wrong. Then another boom, a spark, a flash, and the ground caught fire. It all started with a letter. Greg Thompson never thought much about the Homeowners Association. He paid his dues, mowed his lawn, and kept to himself. But one morning, a pink envelope sat in his mailbox, sticking out like a sore thumb. He sighed. That color could only mean one thing: another violation notice from the HOA. He tore it open. Notice of violation. Your driveway is in non-compliance with HOA standards. Repair or replace it within 30 days to avoid fines. Greg rubbed his temples. His driveway wasn't perfect, sure. A few cracks here and there, but nothing dangerous. He had no idea why the HOA suddenly had a problem with it. And he knew exactly who was behind this: Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. Karen took her job too seriously. She acted like she was the queen of the neighborhood, handing out fines for the smallest things. Mailboxes an inch too high, grass a shade too brown, even holiday decorations she didn't like. Greg wasn't going to let her win. He wasn't going to replace a perfectly fine driveway just because she said so. So, he ignored the letter. 2 weeks later, another pink envelope arrived. Second notice. Failure to comply will result in further action. Greg crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. That was his first mistake. One hot afternoon, Greg heard a strange noise outside, a low rumbling sound. He stepped on his porch, wiping sweat from his forehead, and froze. Karen was standing in his driveway, wearing sunglasses and a smug smile. But what made Greg's stomach drop was the two construction workers behind her, one holding a jackhammer. "What the hell is this?" Greg demanded. Karen crossed her arms. "You're in violation of the HOA rules, Greg. Since you refused to fix it, the HOA is taking matters into its own hands." Greg's jaw clenched. "You can't just tear up my driveway." Karen smirked. "Oh, but I can. The HOA rules give me the authority to enforce compliance. And don't worry, we'll add the cost to your HOA bill." Greg's fists tightened. This was insanity. The construction worker fired up the jackhammer. Greg shouted over the noise, "You have no right." But Karen ignored him. The jackhammer pounded into the concrete. Pieces of pavement flew into the air as the worker tore through Greg's driveway like it was nothing. Greg's anger burned hotter than the sun. He pulled out his phone, recording everything. "You're going to pay for this," he growled. Karen just laughed. "Oh, Greg, you should have just followed the rules." Greg turned to the construction workers. "Stop. There are underground pipes here. You don't know what you're doing." But the worker didn't stop. He kept going, the jackhammer digging deeper, deeper, deeper. Then it happened. A loud crack. A hiss. The worker jumped back, eyes wide with terror. The jackhammer had sliced right into a gas line. Greg's stomach dropped. Karen's smug smile vanished. The hissing grew louder. The smell of gas thickened in the air. Then the sound of screaming. Neighbors ran outside, covering their mouths. Someone yelled, "Oh, my God!" She hit a gas line. Karen staggered backward, her face pale. I didn't know." Greg grabbed her wrist, dragging her away. "Move! We need to get out of here." The gas kept leaking. The noise was deafening. The smell burned Greg's throat. Then, a single spark. A car's loose exhaust pipe. A tiny flicker of heat. Boom! The ground shook. Fire erupted from the hole in the driveway. Flames shot into the sky. Thick black smoke rising fast. A gas explosion. Karen screamed. People ran. Houses shook from the force of the blast. Greg hit the ground as another shockwave rattled the street. The fire spread, crawling up a tree, licking at a parked car's tires. This wasn't just his driveway anymore. This was the whole neighborhood, and it was about to get a lot worse. A second explosion rocked the street, sending debris flying in every direction. The fire was spreading fast, licking at the dry grass and the edges of nearby houses. A mailbox blew apart in a fiery blast, pieces of metal soaring through the air like shrapnel. Greg rolled onto his stomach, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. He could hear people screaming, car alarms blaring, and the frantic barking of dogs. Karen was still frozen in place, her eyes locked onto the fire raging in the middle of what used to be Greg's driveway. Her hands shook. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she muttered. This wasn't. Greg grabbed her arm, yanking her backward. "Karen, move." She stumbled, finally snapping out of her daze, and they both ran. The air sizzled behind them as the fire continued to grow, thick black smoke curling into the sky like a giant snake. A neighbor, Mr. Donovan, an old retired firefighter, sprinted toward them, his face red with panic. "Get back. There's more gas underground. If it reaches the mains, it'll take out the whole block." Greg's heart slammed against his ribs. The main gas line. If that caught fire, it wouldn't just be his house. It would be the entire street. People were already fleeing their homes. Some jumped into cars, others ran on foot. Mothers held their children close. Neighbors shouted to each other, trying to figure out what to do. "Call 911, someone yelled. "I already did," another voice screamed. Greg turned toward his house, his mind racing. He needed to grab his phone, his wallet, something, but the fire was spreading too fast. The air was thick with smoke, making it impossible to breathe. Then he saw something that made his stomach drop. Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman who lived across the street, was trapped on her porch. She gripped the wooden railing, coughing hard, her frail body shaking. Flames were licking at her lawn, creeping closer by the second. Greg didn't think. He just ran. "Greg, you know." Karen screamed after him, but he ignored her. He sprinted across the street, leaping over a burning patch of grass. "MRS, Jenkins," he yelled. "Come on, we have to go." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. I can't," she wheezed. "My knees." Greg cursed under his breath. He bent down, lifting her into his arms. His muscles screamed in protest, but he didn't stop. The fire was too close. He turned, racing back towards safety, just as a third explosion shook the street. Wham! The blast knocked Greg off his feet. He hit the ground hard, shielding Mrs. Jenkins with his body as burning debris rained down around them. Greg groaned, his head spinning. He forced himself up, his ears ringing. Karen and Mr. Donovan were running toward him, shouting something, but the noise in his skull was too loud to hear. Somehow, Greg got back to his feet, staggering away from the spreading flames. He barely made it past the sidewalk before the porch behind him collapsed, the fire swallowing it whole. Before we continue, please click the subscribe button for more amazing stories like this. Thank you. Now back to the story. He set Mrs. Jenkins down on the grass, coughing hard. She gripped his arm weakly. "You saved me," she whispered. Greg nodded, trying to catch his breath. "You're not dying on my watch." But then another sound made his blood run cold. A deep rumbling beneath the ground. A sound that meant only one thing. The main gas line was about to blow. And if it did, the entire neighborhood would go up in flames. 12 hours earlier, Greg had no idea his life was about to be turned upside down. That morning, he woke up, stretched, and made himself a cup of coffee. Everything was normal. The birds chirped outside. The sun shined through the windows. Then, the banging on his door started. Thump, thump, thump. Greg frowned, setting his coffee down. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door and immediately regretted it. Karen stood there, wearing her usual smug expression. She held a clipboard in one hand, tapping a pen against it impatiently. "Good morning, Greg," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. Greg sighed. "What do you want, Karen?" She'd scared. "You still haven't fixed your driveway." Greg folded his arms. "And I told you it's fine the way it is." Karen gave him a tight-lipped smile. "Well, Greg, I have some news. The HOA had a meeting last night, and we voted to handle the repairs for you." Greg's stomach tightened. What does that mean? Karen's smile widened. It means we're replacing your driveway today. Greg's blood boiled. You can't do that. Oh, but we can, she said smugly. HOA regulations allow for mandatory enforcement of community aesthetics. Greg's hands clenched into fists. You're out of your mind if you think I'm going to let you do this. Karen raised a perfectly manicured eyebrow. Oh, Greg, it's already happening. Greg heard the rumbling of a truck behind her. He looked past her and his heart sank. A construction crew was already pulling up in front of his house. A man in a neon vest hopped out of the truck, rolling a jackhammer onto Greg's lawn. Greg shoved past Karen, storming toward the workers. Hey, stop. The foreman, a burly man with a 5 o'clock shadow, looked up. Sorry, sir. We got orders from the HOA. Says here you're in violation. We're just doing our job. This is my property. Greg shouted. You can't just. Karen laughed behind him. Greg. The HOA has every right to enforce the rules. You should have complied when you had the chance. Greg turned back to the worker. If you break my driveway, I'm suing every last one of you. The foreman hesitated, looking at Karen. Karen waved a dismissive hand. Ignore him. He'll calm down. Greg watched in horror as the worker started the jackhammer. The pounding began. The concrete split apart, chunks flying everywhere. Greg felt helpless. His own property being destroyed right in front of him. And then, just as he was about to grab his phone and call the cops, the jackhammer hit something it shouldn't have. A hissing noise filled the air. Greg's breath caught in his throat. The worker stumbled back, his face pale. A boss? We got a problem. Karen frowned. What are you talking about? Just keep going. But Greg knew exactly what had happened. His driveway wasn't just concrete. There were pipes underneath. And one of them was a gas line. A very, very important gas line. Greg's heart raced. Stop everything. Right now. But it was too late. The gas was already leaking, and disaster was only seconds away. The air felt heavy and charged with danger. Greg's heart was pounding so hard, he thought it might burst out his chest. The hissing of the gas continued, getting louder with every passing second. It was like a ticking time bomb. Get back, Greg shouted at the workers, his voice shaking but filled with urgency. He looked around frantically, as if he could physically will them to stop what was happening. The foreman hesitated, glancing nervously at the jackhammer still lodged in the ground. We should call someone, right? He stammered, suddenly realizing the seriousness of the situation. Yes, Greg snapped. Call 911 now. This is a gas leak. You don't mess with that. But it was already too late. The gas had begun to fill the air, thick and suffocating. A burning smell, like rotten eggs, made Greg's stomach turn. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as he backed away from the crack in the driveway, pulling Karen along with him. Karen, who had been frozen with fear, suddenly snapped into action, her eyes wide with panic. What do we do? She screamed, her voice rising higher. Greg didn't answer her. There was only one thing he could do. Get away. Everybody move, Greg yelled, turning toward the street and waving his arms to get everyone's attention. Neighbors who had been standing around, watching the strange scene unfold, finally seemed to wake up to the danger. Evacuate the area, someone shouted. Get out of here. Greg grabbed Mrs. Jenkins's hand and pulled her along as they ran toward the end of the street. He looked back, his mind racing. If the gas line exploded, everything in its path would be destroyed. The whole block, the whole neighborhood. It would be like a bomb going off. He glanced over at Karen, who was still standing at the edge of the driveway, staring at the workers. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. This is all your fault, Greg muttered under his breath, though he knew it wouldn't help to say it now. She didn't seem to hear him, her eyes locked on the crack in the concrete, where gas continued to leak out. We have to get away from here, Greg said again, shaking her. Finally, Karen snapped out her trance. She nodded quickly and followed him, her steps unsure, almost robotic as she stumbled along. They reached the corner of the block, where a group of neighbors had gathered. People were panicked, some were calling 911, others were pacing back and forth. Greg tried to make sense of the situation. It felt like everything was happening in slow motion, like he was watching a disaster unfold and unable to stop it. "Stay back," a voice suddenly shouted from the street. Greg turned to see Mr. Donovan, the retired firefighter, running toward him, waving his arms. His face was tight with worry, and his eyes were focused. "Everyone, move farther away," Mr. Donovan ordered. "Get to the next street, over." Greg didn't hesitate. He grabbed Mrs. Jenkins's arm again and started to run, moving as fast as he could, adrenaline coursing through his body. The neighbors scattered, some running into their houses to grab pets or family members, others huddling together in the street. Then, the ground shuddered beneath them. It was a deep, terrifying rumble that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Greg's blood ran cold. A massive explosion rang out from the driveway. Boom! The sound was deafening. The blast was so powerful that Greg felt the shockwave hit him like a giant fist. He was knocked off his feet, and his vision blurred. He rolled across the grass, his body aching from the impact. Flames shot into the sky from the spot where the driveway used to be. The heat was unbearable, even for where Greg had landed, and he shielded his face with his arm, coughing through the thick smoke. The neighborhood was on fire. No one was safe. Greg struggled to stand, his heart pounding in his chest. The fire was spreading quickly, eating up the grass and the trees, turning the entire street into a flame-filled hellscape. "Greg!" Karen's voice echoed through the chaos. Greg looked around and saw her stumbling toward him, her face stricken with terror. "We have to get out of here. Now," she screamed. Greg nodded, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her in the opposite direction toward the safer end of the block. But the fire was fast, too fast. It was already starting to crawl up the trees, the flames licking at the bark and turning it into charred ash. The firemen still hadn't arrived, and with the gas lines still leaking, there was no telling how far the flames would spread. The whole neighborhood could be gone in minutes. Greg's thoughts were spinning. He could hear people screaming in the distance. Some were calling for loved ones. Others were simply running in a blind panic, not sure where to go. And then a new horrifying sound, a crackling noise. Greg looked up just in time to see a tree near his neighbor's house fall, crashing to the ground and setting another patch of dry grass ablaze. The fire was consuming everything in its path. Karen gasped, "We have to go now." Greg didn't need any more urging. He pulled her faster, moving toward the next street over, where people were starting to gather. But there was no real safety. The fire was everywhere. It was chasing them, faster than they could run. It was only a matter of time before the entire block was engulfed in flames. "We can't outrun it," Greg said, panting. His legs were burning with exhaustion. "We'll be okay," Karen said, her voice shaky but trying to stay hopeful. But Greg didn't believe her. He knew the truth. The whole neighborhood was in danger, and they were all trapped in the middle of it. Greg and Karen barely made it to the next street before the sound of sirens pierced the air. The fire trucks were finally arriving. But the fire was so out of control now that it felt like it was too late. The emergency responders quickly set up a perimeter, urging people to move back even farther. Greg stood in the crowd of worried neighbors, all of them staring at the flames consuming their homes. It wasn't just his driveway anymore. It was their homes. And then, just when Greg thought things couldn't get any worse, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Another deep rumble. The ground shook again. It wasn't just the fire this time. It was something worse. The ground shuddered beneath Greg's feet, harder this time. It wasn't just the fire causing the earth to tremble. It was something much bigger. People gasped and staggered back, looking around in confusion, fear written on every face. The fire trucks were still scrambling to set up hoses, but this new rumbling was distracting, making everyone look up at the sky and the ground beneath their feet. "Everyone get back," a firefighter shouted, pushing through the crowd, his face grim. "Move. Now." Greg's stomach sank. Something was happening. He looked to his left and saw Karen, standing there in shock, her eyes wide. She had no idea what was coming. Neither did Greg, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Suddenly, the rumbling turned into a growl, like something was deep underground, bubbling and shifting. And then, with an ear-splitting crack, the road in front of them split open. The asphalt buckled, rising up in sharp, jagged spikes, as if some massive force had torn it apart from below. Dirt flew everywhere, and the air was filled with the sound of cracking concrete and screeching metal. "Run!" someone screamed, but it was already too late. A fireball erupted from the fissure in the road, sending another wave of heat through the air. The flames were uncontrolled now, like an angry beast breaking free. The street itself seemed to be fighting back, breaking open with a terrifying roar as the explosion rippled through the ground. Greg stumbled back, but Karen was frozen, her mouth agape, eyes wide with horror. The fire was spreading so fast now that it felt like the world was collapsing in on itself. He reached out and grabbed her arm again, this time pulling her with all the strength he had. "Karen, move." But as they turned to run, another explosion ripped through the ground. It was smaller, but it felt just as dangerous. A shockwave hit them, knocking them both to the ground. Greg's face slammed into the pavement, and for a second, he couldn't breathe. He pushed himself up, trying to clear his vision. The smoke was thick and stinging. He looked over at Karen. She was coughing, trying to stand. Get up! Get up!" Greg shouted, helping her to her feet. They were still too close to the fire, too close to the danger. People around them were screaming in panic, some running blindly, others frozen with terror. Greg didn't know where to go. There was no clear safe spot. Everywhere he looked, fire was eating up everything in its path. But the worst part was that the ground was still moving. Every few seconds, there was another crack, another rumble from deep below. Something was shifting underground, and Greg had a sinking feeling it was going to be much worse than anything they'd seen so far. "Greg!" Karen gasped, pointing at the street ahead. Greg followed her gaze, and his heart dropped into his stomach. The crack in the road was growing wider. And now it wasn't just a crack. It was a huge, gaping hole that seemed to be swallowing the entire street. The earth was collapsing, caving in on itself as the flames surged higher, feeding off whatever was underneath. The road buckled and cracked, splitting apart like old paper, exposing deep, dark gaps. But that wasn't the worst part. From deep within the earth, there was a low rumble, an ominous sound that was unlike anything Greg had ever heard. The ground felt like it was going to swallow them whole. And then, with a terrifying crash, something shot up from the hole. It was metal, a huge steel pipe, twisted and bent, its surface blackened and scorched. But the thing that made Greg's blood run cold wasn't the pipe. It was the bright orange glow coming from inside it. "Gas!" someone screamed in the distance. "The gas main's ruptured. We're all going to die." Greg's brain worked in overdrive. He didn't have time to think. He just acted. "Run!" Greg screamed, grabbing Karen and pulling her as hard as he could toward the street corner. He barely registered the chaos around them. People running, crying, screaming, the noise of the fire roaring in his ears, the ground shaking beneath him. But the ground was collapsing faster now. The steel pipe continued to hiss and groan, spitting gas into the air, the fumes so thick and heavy that it felt like the whole neighborhood was choking on it. "Greg, Karen started, but she didn't finish. An earth-shattering explosion rang out. The fire surged, and a shock wave from the blast knocked them both off their feet. Greg felt himself being thrown backward like a rag doll, slamming hard against the asphalt. His vision went black for a moment. When he opened his eyes again, the world was a blur of flames and smoke. His body ached, his ears ringing with the sounds of the destruction. He felt like he was buried under the weight of the world, but he pushed through, shaking his head to clear it. "Karen!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. He scrambled to his feet, coughing as he wiped ash from his eyes. The fire was so close now, the air nearly unbreathable. "Karen!" Greg screamed again, panic rising in his chest. And then, through the thick smoke, he saw her. She was lying on the ground, motionless, her body crumpled against a lamppost. Greg's heart dropped into his stomach. "Karen, no, no, please." He rushed to her, falling to his knees beside her. She was barely conscious, her eyes unfocused and glazed over. Her clothes were singed, and she was covered in soot. "Karen," Greg said urgently, shaking her gently. "Karen, talk to me. Please." Her eyelids fluttered, and she managed a weak, strained cough. "Gee, Greg," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the fire. "Karen, we need to get out of here," Greg said desperately, lifting her up as best as he could. "The fire's coming. We can't stay here." But Karen didn't respond. She was barely holding on. And just then, the ground shook again. Greg didn't know how much more of this he could take. He didn't know if he'd survive it, if they'd survive it. The fire was spreading faster than he could run. The explosions, the collapsing roads, the gas, the smoke. It was all becoming too much. And in that moment, Greg understood something he hadn't quite fully realized before. This wasn't just a fire. This wasn't some freak accident. The entire neighborhood was about to be destroyed, and they were stuck in the middle of it. The ground rumbled again, louder this time, as if the earth itself was groaning under the weight of something far more powerful than anyone could imagine. Greg could feel it in his bones. The gas leak, the fire, the collapsing ground. It was all happening too fast. Everything was slipping away, and he couldn't stop it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Karen was still weak in his arms, barely conscious. He could feel the heat from the flames creeping closer, the smoke thickening the air, but he had to move. There was no other choice. They couldn't stay here. "Come on, Karen," Greg muttered, his voice breaking. "We need to go. Just a little further, please." She was barely responsive, but her head nodded slightly, and Greg took that as a sign to keep going. He pulled her with all his strength, dragging her across the street, away from the heart of the fire, toward the safety of the next block. But every step felt like it was too slow. The flames were closing in around them, and Greg could hear the sounds of chaos behind him. The screams, the explosions, the desperate shouts of neighbors trying to escape. It felt like the world was collapsing into fire and smoke. He barely had time to think as he spotted another neighbor, Mrs. Cartwright, standing frozen in place, staring at the growing inferno ahead. She wasn't moving, and that terrified Greg. "Mrs. Cartwright," Greg shouted, his voice barely cutting through the rising panic. He released Karen for a moment and ran toward her. "Mrs. Cartwright, you need to leave now." But she didn't seem to hear him. She was staring ahead, her face pale with terror, eyes fixed on the flames. "Mrs. Cartwright," Greg shouted again, grabbing her shoulder and shaking her. "You have to move. Please, it's not safe." Her eyes flickered to him, but her lips trembled. I don't know if I can," she whispered, her voice shaking. Greg's heart pounded as he grabbed her arm, pulling her along. "I'm not leaving you here, come on." But just as they started to move, there was a massive explosion from behind them. A shockwave hit the ground, knocking them all to the ground. The blast was so powerful that Greg's head spun and his ears rang with the deafening sound. He fought to stay conscious, his hands clutching Mrs. Cartwright as the world around him seemed to fall apart. When Greg opened his eyes again, the world was hazy. He could barely breathe through the thick smoke in the air. He pushed himself up, his body aching. Mrs. Cartwright was still clinging to him, but Karen was nowhere to be seen. No, Greg muttered under his breath, panic rising in his chest. His heart raced as he looked around, searching for Karen. He spotted her just a few feet away. She was still lying on the ground, her face turned toward the pavement, and she wasn't moving. Greg's stomach dropped. He knew they didn't have much time. The fire was getting closer. The smoke was suffocating. If he didn't get her out of here right now, she might not survive it. Without thinking, Greg rushed toward her. "Karen," he yelled, his voice raw with panic. He knelt beside her, shaking her gently. "Karen, please wake up." Her eyelids fluttered, and she groaned, but she didn't open her eyes. Greg couldn't wait any longer. He lifted her in his arms again, this time more carefully, trying not to jostle her too much. Mrs. Cartwright was still holding on to him, but Greg was moving faster now, desperate to get them both somewhere safer. He didn't know where that was. He just knew they needed to get as far away from the fire as possible. Boom! Another explosion shook the ground, sending a cloud of dirt and debris into the air. It was too close. The flames were everywhere now. The road was a maze of cracks and holes. and fire was spreading from one house to the next. It was almost like a living thing, slithering across the ground, devouring everything in its path. Greg stumbled, the heat pushing against him like a wall. Sweat poured down his face, his hands slick as he struggled to keep Karen in his arms. He couldn't afford to stop, couldn't afford to rest. They had to keep moving, but every step felt like it was getting harder. "Greg, we can't," Mrs. Cartwright whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes, we can," Greg insisted, his teeth gritted. "We can do this. Just a little more." But as he rounded the corner of the block, he realized something that made his heart sink. The street was blocked. A row of fire trucks and ambulances had blocked off the road ahead. They had nowhere to go. "No," Greg muttered. He turned around, his eyes darting across the street, looking for any escape. But all he could see was fire that was closing in. The flames were growing taller, the heat more intense. He could feel it on his skin, hear the crackling of the burning buildings all around him. The fire trucks were trying to fight it, but there were just too many flames, too many explosions. The gas line ruptures kept feeding the fire, making it grow uncontrollably. "We can't just stand here," Greg said, his voice desperate. He had to think. He had to figure something out. And then his gaze fell on the alleyway beside the fire trucks. It wasn't much, but it was an option, a small, narrow passage between two buildings. It was dark, hidden from the main street. It wasn't safe, but it was their best chance. "This way," Greg shouted, turning back to Mrs. Cartwright. "Come on." He didn't wait for her response. He sprinted toward the alley, praying that it would lead them somewhere safe. He could hear her footsteps behind him, slower than his, but still moving. As they reached the alley, Greg looked back one last time, and his heart froze. The explosions behind them were getting worse. The flames were racing toward them now, and the roar of the fire was deafening. They were running out of time. Greg and Mrs. Cartwright pushed forward, the alleyway seeming to stretch endlessly in front of them. He didn't know if they were safe or if they were heading straight into even more danger. But he had to believe they could make it. He had to. They had to get out. The alley was narrow and dark, the shadows creeping up the walls as Greg pushed forward, dragging Mrs. Cartwright behind him. The flames still roared behind them, growing louder, faster, as if the fire. Greg's breath came in ragged bursts, his lungs burning with each inhaled puff of thick smoke. His legs were starting to ache from carrying Karen, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. He glanced over his shoulder, eyes darting quickly as the flickering glow from the fire spilled into the alleyway, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The crackling of the flames was deafening, but Greg kept his focus on the path ahead. There was no turning back. The alley stretched on, and it seemed like there was no end in sight. But Greg knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay here. "Karen," Greg whispered, his voice hoarse. He didn't know if she could hear him, but he had to say it. "You're going to be okay. Just hang on." But there was no response. Her head lulled against his shoulder, her breathing shallow and weak. He wanted to believe she was going to be all right, but the fear gnawing at him kept whispering doubts in his ear. Suddenly, Greg heard something. A voice. "Over here," the voice shouted, faint and distant. "Hurry." Greg's heart skipped a beat. Was it a rescuer? Could it be someone who had found a way out of this nightmare? He didn't wait to find out. He turned sharply and pulled Mrs. Cartwright to the side, squeezing through a narrow gap between two brick walls. The alleyway opened up slightly ahead, where a small group of people stood, some carrying children, some clutching pets, all looking just as terrified as he felt. There, standing at the forefront of the group, was Mr. Donovan, the retired firefighter. His face was streaked with soot, but he looked at Greg with a mixture of relief and urgency. "We need to keep moving," Mr. Donovan shouted over the chaos. "The fire's spreading fast. We've got a safe route to the next block, but we have to go now." Greg barely had time to nod before Mr. Donovan turned and led the group forward. They moved swiftly, weaving through a maze of narrow alleyways, the crackling sound of the fire ever present behind them. As they ran, Greg couldn't help but glance back once again, his heart heavy. The neighborhood he had lived in for years, the life he knew, was burning to the ground. He wasn't sure if the fire would ever be contained. He wasn't sure if anyone would be able to stop it. The situation felt helpless, like a force too powerful to be stopped. But they had to keep moving. They had to survive. Greg kept his pace steady, carrying Karen as best as he could, though the weight of the situation was starting to weigh on him. The air was thick with ash, and the fire seemed to follow them wherever they went. No matter how far they ran, it was always right behind them. After what felt like an eternity of running through alleyways and dodging flames, Greg's legs finally began to give out. He was exhausted, his body begging for rest, but he knew he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when they were so close. Mr. Donovan led them to a small, seemingly untouched patch of land, a tiny park that sat at the edge of the neighborhood, right before the fire could spread any further. The trees around it were still intact, their leaves green, untouched by the inferno that was consuming everything else. It was their safe haven for now. Greg gently set Karen down on the ground, his breath coming in shallow, labored gasps. Mrs. Cartwright sank to the ground beside him, her hands shaking as she clutched her chest. They were both too weak to move, but they had made it. "We need water," Mr. Donovan said, his voice tight. "I know this park has a community center with a hose. It's our only chance to cool down and get some air." Greg nodded, his mind spinning with exhaustion, but the urgency in Mr. Donovan's voice kept him alert. "I'll go with you," Greg said, his voice hoarse. "We need to—" Before he could finish his sentence, a loud crackling noise filled the air, followed by a thunderous rumble that shook the ground beneath them. The fire was still coming. The explosion from the gas line earlier had triggered something much worse, something they hadn't anticipated. Greg's heart sank into his stomach as he realized the ground was shaking more violently now. "We need to get out of here," Greg shouted, grabbing Karen under the shoulders again. His pulse raced, and he could feel his skin crawling from the sheer terror that surged through his veins. But just as Greg started to lift Karen again, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A second explosion. The gas line, the one they had barely escaped, had ruptured again, and it wasn't just a small blast. It was massive. The sky turned a sickly orange as flames shot up in a second eruption, and Greg knew immediately that they were too close. The explosion tore through the air. It was as though the earth had split open again. A huge wave of fire and debris rained down around them. The heat was unbearable. The air was choking with smoke and burning embers. People screamed in every direction, some collapsing, others running, trying to get away. Greg felt his skin burn as the shockwave from the explosion hit him. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and he could barely keep his balance. He stumbled backward, holding on to Karen with one hand, trying to shield her with his body. "We're trapped," Mrs. Cartwright screamed, her voice high-pitched with terror. Greg's mind was racing. There was no way out, no escape. The fire had surrounded them. The second explosion had cut off their path, trapping them in the park with the flames closing in from every direction. It was too much. But then, through the smoke, Greg saw something, a shadow moving quickly toward them. A figure moving through the chaos. "Help!" Greg shouted, trying to get the person's attention. "Please help us." The figure turned toward him, their face covered with a mask and goggles. They raised a hand, signaling for them to follow. It was a firefighter. Without thinking, Greg started running toward them, dragging Karen behind him. The firefighter waved them over urgently. "Hurry!" the firefighter shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. Greg didn't need another word. He grabbed Mrs. Cartwright and ran, his heart hammering, every step feeling like it could be their last. The firefighter led them to a fire truck, and they climbed in quickly. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the truck sped off, the lights flashing. But as they looked back at the neighborhood they'd left behind, Greg knew the worst wasn't over. The fire was still raging, still spreading, and there were still people trapped in the destruction. As they drove away, Greg felt something in his gut. A hollow ache, a fear that wouldn't leave. He didn't know if they'd ever make it out of this alive. But for now, all he could do was hold on. The fire truck's sirens wailed as they sped through the streets, cutting through the thick smoke like a knife. The air outside felt hot, suffocating, as if the flames were chasing them down the road. Inside the truck, the world was a blur. Flashes of light, the crackling of fire, the sound of sirens and shouting voices. Greg held on to Karen, her head resting against his shoulder, her breathing still shallow but steadier than it had been before. Mrs. Cartwright sat next to them, her eyes wide with fear, her hands trembling. The firefighter in the front seat was focused on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly, but there was an urgency in his eyes. The fire was spreading too fast. "We need to get to the evacuation zone," the firefighter said, his voice grim. "The fire's moving quicker than we thought. We'll take you to the safe zone where the authorities are gathering people. Stay low, keep your heads down." Greg nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of everything they had left behind. Their homes, their lives. It felt like everything was slipping away. And Karen, Greg's heart twisted as he glanced at her. She was so pale now, barely conscious, her eyes flickering with the effort to stay awake. She had been so strong earlier, but now she seemed so small, so fragile. The truck bounced over the uneven road, and Greg tightened his grip on her, trying to comfort her, though he felt just as lost as she looked. There was so much he needed to say, so much he wanted to do, but everything felt so out of control. "Karen," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. "Stay with me. Please, just stay with me." For a moment, he thought she might slip away from him entirely. But then, just as he was about to give in to the crushing despair, she turned her head slightly, her eyes opening for the briefest moment. I'm here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hand reached out weakly, and Greg squeezed it, relief flooding his chest. "Thank God," he whispered back, his eyes filling with tears. "We're going to make it. You're going to be okay." The firefighter in the front seat looked over his shoulder briefly, his face tight. "We're almost there," he said. "Stay alert. The roads are getting more dangerous." Greg nodded and turned his attention back to the window, watching as the world outside seemed to burn away. The flames had turned everything into a nightmare. Smoke billowing high into the sky, cars abandoned on the side of the road, people running for their lives. The truck hit a bump, and Karen let out a soft gasp, her body jerking. Greg looked down at her, feeling a cold wave of panic. "Karen," he asked, his voice tight with worry, "are you okay?" She opened her eyes again, blinking slowly, her lips parting in an attempt to speak. I'm cold," she whispered weakly, her voice a soft rasp. "So cold." Greg's heart sank. He could feel the temperature rising inside the truck, but Karen's body was trembling in his arms, and he couldn't understand why. She was covered in sweat, her skin clammy. "We're almost there," Greg said, though he didn't know if she could hear him. He stroked her hair, trying to comfort her, trying to keep her awake. "Just hold on. We're almost to safety." But Karen didn't respond. She seemed to drift in and out of consciousness, her head resting heavily against Greg's shoulder, her breath slow and ragged. The fire truck screeched to a halt, jerking Greg forward, and he quickly checked on Karen. She had a slight fever, her body burning up despite the cold sweat on her skin. His pulse quickened. This wasn't just exhaustion. There was something more, something wrong. The firefighter jumped out of the truck and immediately began directing people toward a set of tents set up at the evacuation center. Greg helped Mrs. Cartwright out of the truck, but his eyes were glued to Karen. He couldn't let her out of his sight for a second. "Greg, come on," Mrs. Cartwright called, looking back at him. "We have to get to safety." He didn't need to be told twice. He scooped Karen up carefully, her body feeling too light in his arms, and followed Mrs. Cartwright toward the tents. The evacuation zone was a flurry of activity. People were shouting, emergency workers were tending to the injured, and the air was thick with tension and fear. Greg walked past the tents, trying to find a safe place for Karen, his mind racing with worry. He had to get her help. She wasn't getting any better, and the fever was only getting worse. He stopped in front of a medic station and immediately approached a young nurse who was setting up supplies. "Please," Greg said, his voice shaking. "She needs help. She's burning up. Can you do something?" The nurse looked at Karen and quickly nodded. "We'll take care of her. Get her over here." Greg carefully handed Karen over to the nurse, his chest tight with anxiety. The nurse moved quickly, checking Karen's vitals and assessing her condition. She's severely dehydrated and suffering from heat exhaustion, the nurse said, her voice calm but urgent. We'll get her fluids, but she needs rest and some cooling. It's a good thing you brought her in when you did. Greg couldn't breathe a sigh of relief yet, not when he didn't know if she'd be okay. Can I stay with her? He asked, his voice breaking. The nurse nodded. Of course. You can stay with her while we do what we can. Greg sat beside Karen's bed, his hand gently holding hers as they worked on her. The minutes felt like hours, and every second that passed felt like it stretched into eternity. He couldn't tear his eyes away from her face, watching as the nurse administered fluids and began to cool her down. Finally, after what felt like an endless wait, Karen's breathing began to stabilize. The fever seemed to ease a little. Her skin cooled, and her grip on Greg's hand tightened. Greg, Karen whispered, her voice hoarse. Greg squeezed her hand gently, a wave of relief washing over him. I'm here, Karen. You're going to be okay. Just rest now. She gave him a faint smile, and then closed her eyes, finally drifting into a deep sleep. Greg sat beside her, watching over her, still in disbelief that they had made it this far. The fire was still raging in the distance, but they were safe for now. But Greg knew the fight wasn't over. The neighborhood, the homes, the lives that had been lost. It was all still a part of the chaos they had barely escaped. And even though they had made it to safety, Greg knew one thing for sure. The nightmare was far from over. The fire continued to rage in the distance, its fiery fingers still reaching for the sky, sending plumes of smoke into the air. The sound of sirens and the crackling of flames echoed faintly even in the relative safety of the evacuation zone. But for now, they were safe. Greg sat beside Karen, his hand still holding hers, not daring to let go. He hadn't left her side for hours. She was stable for now, her fever finally starting to break after the fluids and cooling treatments. He could see the colors slowly returning to her face, but the memory of those terrifying moments when she had barely been conscious still haunted him. The world around him was a blur of frantic activity. Paramedics moving from one victim to the next, families anxiously waiting for news about their homes, and a sense of raw, unrelenting fear that seemed to hang in the air. Greg could hardly believe how fast things had spiraled out of control. 1 minute, he was trying to hold his ground against an overzealous HOA president, and the next, he was fighting to escape an all-consuming firestorm. His mind kept drifting back to the chaos, the explosions, the gas leaks, the firestorms that seemed to take over their entire neighborhood. The devastation had been unimaginable, and yet, here they were, surviving when so many others hadn't. It was a miracle, but also a curse. Greg's chest tightened as he looked around at the faces of people who had lost everything. Their homes, their memories, the lives they'd built, all gone in an instant. Greg couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that gnawed at him. They were lucky to have escaped. But for how long? Greg, Karen whispered, breaking his train of thought. He turned his attention to her, her eyes fluttering open. Her voice was weak, but there was a hint of recognition in her gaze. She was awake. She was really awake. Karen, you're okay, Greg said, relief flooding his voice as he squeezed her hand. She smiled faintly. I didn't want to leave you, Greg. I didn't want to. Don't, Greg interrupted, shaking his head. Don't apologize. You're here, and that's what matters. Her eyes wandered around the small medic station, and she seemed to be taking everything in with a sense of disorientation. How long? She asked, her voice trailing off. Hours, Greg said gently. It's been hours. The fire's still out there, but we're safe here. She blinked a few times, and Greg could see the fog lifting from her mind. She was slowly coming back to herself. But there was something in her eyes that made him uneasy, something that made him wonder if she fully realized the scale of what had happened. Greg, what about the neighborhood? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What happened to everyone else? Greg's heart sank. He wasn't sure how to answer that question. There was no simple explanation. I don't know, Greg said quietly. I don't know what happened to the others. The fire's still burning, and they're still trying to get people out. but there's no telling how many were caught in it or how many homes have been lost. Karen's gaze grew distant. She didn't speak for a long moment, as if processing the magnitude of what had happened. She was quiet, staring at the floor, lost in thought. Greg's grip on her hand tightened slightly, but he knew better than to pressure her. She needed time to process the nightmare they'd survived. "We'll figure it out," Greg said finally, trying to offer her some comfort. "One step at a time, Karen. We'll figure it out." She nodded faintly, but her eyes were still clouded with doubt and sorrow. The air around them felt heavy, thick with the questions that had no answers. The destruction of their neighborhood, the families that might never return. It was all too overwhelming. Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence. "Greg!" He looked up and saw Mrs. Cartwright, moving toward them with hurried steps. Her face was drawn, her eyes filled with worry. "They're talking about evacuation," she said, her voice urgent. "They're trying to get everyone out of the area, and they need volunteers to help." Greg blinked, still processing her words. "Volunteers?" he asked, confusion written on his face. "What do you mean, volunteers?" "The local authorities are setting up a larger evacuation zone," Mrs. Cartwright explained. "But they need people to help with the organization, moving people out of the danger zone, directing traffic, stuff like that. The situation's getting worse, and they're calling for everyone who can help to step forward." Greg glanced down at Karen, who was still lying on the cot, her hand in his. Her eyes were closed now, but she was clearly listening. I don't know, Mrs. Cartwright," Greg began. "Karen's still weak. She needs rest, and I'm not sure it's safe to leave her right now." Mrs. Cartwright looked at him with a sense of urgency in her eyes. "I understand, Greg, but look around you. People are scared. People are still stuck out there, and the authorities need all the help they can get. This is bigger than us." Greg stared at her, weighing her words. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face the chaos again, not after everything that had happened. But he couldn't ignore the truth. People still needed help. They still needed to get to safety. "I'll stay with her," Mrs. Cartwright said softly, her voice calm but firm. "You go. Help where you can. I'll make sure Karen's okay." Greg hesitated for only a second. He looked back at Karen, who was now sleeping soundly, her body recovering from the shock. "All right," Greg said, standing up. "I'll go, but stay with her. Don't leave her side. I'll be back as soon as I can." He moved quickly, walking toward the volunteer station set up on the other side of the camp. As he moved through the crowd, he couldn't help but feel a wave of uncertainty. He didn't know if helping would make a difference, but he had to try. It was the only thing he could do. When he reached the station, a man in a uniform greeted him. "Are you here to help?" the man asked. "We're getting people ready for the next evacuation. We need all hands on deck." Greg nodded. "Yes. What can I do?" The man handed Greg a map. "We need to get these people out of here before the fire spreads any further. Some of the roads are impassable, so we need volunteers to help clear paths, guide people to safety, and direct traffic." Greg took the map, but his heart was heavy. The entire situation felt like a nightmare. But he pushed through. He had to. As he set off to help organize the evacuation, the enormity of what lay ahead hit him once more. The fire was still out there, still tearing through the area, and now Greg had to help people escape it. He didn't know if he could fix what was happening. He didn't know if they would make it out of this alive. But he had to believe there was still hope. He had to believe there was something worth fighting for. And even though his mind was clouded with doubt, he couldn't give up now. Not when Karen and so many others still needed him. The evacuation zone was in full swing as Greg moved through the crowd, trying to keep his mind focused on the task at hand. People were everywhere, some standing in groups, others sitting on the grass, their faces tired and drained. It was as if the weight of the world had fallen upon the entire neighborhood, leaving everyone struggling to stay afloat. Greg had taken the volunteer map, and, with it, a sense of duty. But deep down, he still wasn't sure what he was doing. How could he make a difference? The fire was still burning, and there were so many people to help. Was it even possible to get them all out in time? And what about Karen? He had left her behind, and even though he trusted Mrs. Cartwright to look after her, part of him felt like he'd abandoned her. The sound of the fire truck's sirens still echoed in his ears, even here, far from the source of the flames. He couldn't help but glance back toward the smoke-filled sky, as if hoping for a sign that it would all end. But there was nothing, just the suffocating presence of the flames still spreading through the area, inching closer. Greg had to push those thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to be distracted. People needed him now. A woman came rushing up to him, her face frantic. She was holding a small child in her arms, and her eyes were wide with panic. "Please," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "My husband is still inside. He didn't make it out when they told us to leave. He's in a house, but I can't go back for him. You have to help." Greg's heart clenched as he looked at the woman and her child. She was terrified, her hands trembling as she clutched the child to her chest. The flames were too close for her to go back. There was no time. "I'll go," Greg said, his voice steady even though his mind was racing. "Stay here. I'll get him out." Without waiting for a response, Greg turned and began running toward the direction the woman had pointed to. The house was just a few streets away, still standing tall, but surrounded by fire. Greg could see the smoke rising in thick clouds, and he could hear the sound of crackling wood as the flames consumed everything in there. He had to move quickly. He could feel the heat growing stronger with every step he took, but he didn't dare stop. He had made a promise. The woman was counting on him. As Greg reached the house, he could see that it was too close to the blaze. The fire had already spread to the nearby trees, their branches glowing red with the heat. Time was running out. "Hello," Greg shouted, trying to make himself heard above the roar of the fire. "Is anyone inside?" There was no answer. The heat was almost unbearable, but Greg wasn't going to give up. He ran to the front door, which was barely hanging on its hinges, and tried to push it open. The door creaked and groaned, but it wouldn't budge. "Damn it," Greg muttered under his breath. The fire was too close. The house was too hot. In a flash of inspiration, he turned and grabbed a nearby piece of wood that had fallen from the burning tree. Using it as a makeshift battering ram, he slammed it into the door. The force of the blow caused the door to crash inward, and Greg rushed inside. The smoke was thick. It filled his lungs, and the air was scorching hot. He had to find the man, and he had to find him quickly. "Hello," Greg called again, his voice hoarse as he moved deeper into the house. "I'm here to help. If you can hear me, make some noise." There was a coughing sound, weak but distinct, coming from the back of the house. Greg's heart raced as he followed the sound, moving through the smoke-filled hallway. The fire was closer now. He could see the glow from the flames creeping through the walls, and he knew he didn't have much time left. The coughing grew louder, and finally, Greg found the man lying on the floor in the living room, coughing violently. He was an older man, disoriented and gasping for air, clearly struggling to breathe. His face was covered in soot, and he was shaking, but he was alive. "Hey, it's okay," Greg said, kneeling beside him. He could feel the heat coming off the walls, the air thick with smoke. "I'm here to get you out. We need to go now." The man looked up at him, his eyes wide with fear. "The fire. It's everywhere," he gasped. "I couldn't make it out. I thought I was going to burn." Greg helped him to his feet, supporting him as best as he could. The man was weak, but he was still conscious. "We're getting out of here," Greg said firmly. "Follow me. Stay close." Greg led the man toward the door, but just as they were about to exit, a loud crash echoed from above. The ceiling buckled under the heat, and part of the roof collapsed, blocking their way. "No!" Greg shouted, his mind racing. They couldn't go back the way they came. The heat was unbearable now, the flames closing in. Greg's body screamed for air, his throat burning from the smoke. He glanced around frantically, searching for a way out. Then he saw it, the back door just a few feet away. "We're going out the back," Greg yelled, pulling the man toward the door. They stumbled forward, barely avoiding the fallen debris. As they reached the back door, the man collapsed again, his legs giving way from the heat. Greg pulled him up and shoved him through the door, out into the yard. They were in the clear for now, but the fire was still spreading, and it was closing in fast. Greg looked over his shoulder one last time at the house, now completely consumed by the fire. The flames were so high now that the house was almost unrecognizable. They had made it out, but barely. Greg helped the man to his feet again, his muscles burning from the effort, his body drenched in sweat. He glanced around, searching for a safe route, but all he could see were flames and smoke. There was nowhere to go but forward, away from the fire. They ran as fast as they could, stumbling over debris, desperate to get to safety. And then Greg's eyes caught something. A group of firefighters rushing toward them, their hoses spraying water in all directions. "Over here!" Greg shouted, waving his arms. The firefighters rushed toward them, their faces grim but determined. One of them immediately took the man from Greg's arms and began checking him for injuries. "We've got him," one of the firefighters said. "You need to get to the evacuation zone. It's not safe here." Greg nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done what he came to do. But as he walked toward the evacuation zone, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The fire was still burning, still swallowing everything in its path. And there were still people out there who needed help. Greg took a deep breath and pushed forward. There was no turning back now. The evacuation zone was a chaotic frenzy of movement. People were everywhere. Some were crying, others were shouting, and many were still in shock, staring blankly into the distance. The street that led to the safe zone was lined with emergency vehicles, and Greg could hear the sounds of fire trucks, ambulances, and helicopters buzzing above. It was a scene from a nightmare that didn't seem to end. Greg's feet felt heavy, his body drained from exhaustion. But he couldn't stop now. There were still people out there. People who hadn't made it out yet. People who were still stuck in the burning neighborhoods. His mind kept racing back to the people he'd left behind. Mrs. Cartwright. Karen. The thought of her made his chest tighten. He couldn't shake the image of her lying in the medic tent, barely conscious. What if she didn't make it? What if, despite all his efforts, he couldn't save her? He had to push those thoughts aside. She was alive, and that was enough for now. She was strong. She had to be. But as he made his way through the evacuation zone, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. The fire wasn't just contained to one area, it was spreading across the entire city. The flames were eating up everything in their path, and every new report that came in seemed worse than the last. There were entire neighborhoods that were already gone. Greg stumbled toward the tents, hoping to find Karen. As he approached, he spotted Mrs. Cartwright sitting nearby, her eyes scanning the crowd. She looked up when she saw him, a sigh of relief escaping her lips. "Greg," she called, her voice soft but urgent. "Thank God you're here. Karen's awake." Greg's heart skipped a beat. Karen was awake. He rushed over to her, his breath catching in his throat. She was sitting up now, though she still looked pale and weak, her eyes a little glassy. Mrs. Cartwright had kept a watchful eye on her, and despite the exhaustion in her own face, she gave Greg a small smile as he approached. "Karen," Greg said softly, kneeling beside her. "How are you feeling?" Karen blinked slowly, her hand reaching out to touch his. "Tired," she whispered, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm okay." Greg could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air between them. Okay. How could anyone be okay after what they'd been through? But it was the best they could do for now. She was alive. "Rest as much as you can," Greg said, his hand resting gently on hers. "You've been through a lot." Karen gave a faint nod, but didn't seem to want to close her eyes. She looked around at the other evacuees, her expression worried. "What about everyone else?" she asked quietly. "What about the houses?" Greg swallowed hard. "I don't know. People are still being pulled out, but there's nothing left for some of them. The fire's spreading too quickly, I think." Before he could finish, a loud crackling sound echoed through the camp. It was the sound of more explosions. The air seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of it, and everyone around them froze. "Not again," Greg muttered, standing quickly. His heart started pounding again, and he grabbed Karen's hand, pulling her up with him. The moment the explosion hit, people began shouting and running. The flames hadn't stopped. "Everyone, stay calm," someone shouted from the far side of the camp. "We need to get back to safety. Move, move, move." Greg pulled Karen along with him, weaving through the crowd. He could hear people screaming in the distance, and the crackling of the fire was louder now. The fire wasn't going to stop. It was everywhere, And suddenly, it hit him. The fire wasn't just burning the neighborhood. It was spreading across the city. The city was in danger. "Get to the far side of the camp," someone shouted again. "We're moving the evacuation point." Greg's heart raced as he scanned the area. The fire was advancing, and there was no time to waste. He couldn't lose Karen again. They pushed their way through the crowd, trying to keep up with the emergency teams that were already moving toward a new evacuation point. The streets were a maze of debris and dust. The air was heavy with smoke, and it was becoming harder to breathe with each passing minute. They finally reached a section where a group of volunteers were setting up another perimeter. The fire seemed closer now, the sky above them tinged orange with the blaze. Greg helped Karen to sit down near the new tents, and a medic came over quickly to check on her. Mrs. Cartwright, still moving with surprising strength, helped him set up a small area for them to rest. "You did good," Mrs. Cartwright said, her voice hoarse. "You saved that man earlier. I saw you. And now Karen's here. You did good." Greg nodded, but didn't say anything. He had done what he could. But it wasn't enough. The fire was still coming. It wasn't over. He looked around at the other evacuees, people sitting in makeshift shelters, families huddled together, some of them still in their pajamas, others in torn clothes. They were survivors, but they were also living in limbo, unsure of what would come next. Greg had no idea how long they would be here, waiting for the next order to evacuate. Would they even have a place to go after this? Would their homes still be there? "How long will this last?" Karen asked, her voice barely audible, breaking Greg from his thoughts. She was looking up at him now, her face pale, but her eyes determined. Greg exhaled slowly. "I don't know, Karen, but we'll make it through. I promise you that." But even as he said the words, Greg couldn't help the feeling of dread that settled in his stomach. The fire was far from over. It was only a matter of time before they had to run again. The evacuation zone wasn't a safe haven. It was just the next stop in the fight for survival. Greg's mind was racing, trying to process everything. The devastation, the people who had already lost everything. He knew it was only a matter of time before he would have to make another decision. A decision that might lead him further away from the people he loved. But for now, the fire was still coming, and they were still trapped in the storm of it. And that meant they had to fight back. The fire was relentless. It was like an unstoppable force of nature, spreading with a vengeance and devouring everything in its path. The orange glow of the flames was now visible even in the middle of the night, painting the sky with an eerie, fiery hue. The smoke was thick and suffocating, and the air tasted of ash and desperation. Greg sat beside Karen, still holding her hand, trying to keep her calm as they waited in the makeshift camp. The once quiet, peaceful neighborhood was now unrecognizable. Every person in this camp had lost something, homes, memories, and even loved ones. Yet here they were, survivors, waiting for the fire to run its course, waiting for the next order to evacuate. Karen was still pale, but her fever had finally broken, and her breathing had steadied. It was clear she was exhausted, but there was something about her that refused to stay down. "I'm not going to let this fire take us," she said, her voice strong despite her exhaustion. "We're going to survive, Greg. We have to." Greg nodded, though his heart was heavy. He had to keep the hope alive, for her, for everyone around them. But the truth weighed on him like a stone. He had no idea how long this would last, how long they would be stuck here, running from the flames. Suddenly, a loud voice cut through the night air. "Everyone, listen up," a firefighter shouted, his voice crackling through a megaphone. "We're moving the evacuation point again. The fire is closing in faster than expected. We need everyone to move now, immediately." Greg's pulse quickened. The fire was already close, but now it was even closer. He had seen the flames creeping along the trees earlier, but now they were within a few miles of the camp. They had to leave, and they had to leave now. "Karen," Greg said urgently, shaking her gently. "We have to go. Right now." Karen's eyes widened in understanding. She nodded slowly, but she wasn't moving as quickly as Greg had hoped. He helped her to her feet, but the exhaustion in her body was apparent. "We'll make it," Greg said softly, trying to reassure her. "Just a little further, I promise." They moved through the crowd, the sense of urgency pressing down on them with every passing second. The air seemed to crackle with tension, and Greg could feel the heat in the distance. Unmistakable. The fire was coming for them. As they moved toward the new evacuation point, Greg could hear the faint sound of engines starting. More trucks, more teams moving people. Some of the survivors were already loading onto buses and emergency vehicles, their faces strained, their eyes wide with fear. Others were still standing in the open, unsure of what to do next, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of hope. Greg and Karen were almost at the new zone when they heard another voice, a panicked voice. "Help! Please, someone help me." Greg froze. The voice came from an alley nearby, the cry of someone in distress, someone who still needed help. He turned toward Karen, but she was still too weak to move on her own. "Stay here," Greg said quickly. "I'll be back in a minute. I need to help." "Greg," Karen said, her voice faint but strong. "Please don't leave me." Greg hesitated for just a moment. The sounds of the fire were growing louder now, and time was running out. He couldn't leave her, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the voice. "I won't be long," he promised, leaning down to kiss her forehead gently. "Stay close to Mrs. Cartwright. I won't let anything happen to you." Karen nodded, though her eyes were filled with worry as she watched him run toward the alley. The sound of the fire grew louder as he moved forward. The smoke burned in his lungs, but Greg pushed through it. The crackling of the flames seemed to be everywhere now, and it was getting harder to see as the smoke thickened. The voice called out again. "Help me. Please, someone help." Greg's heart raced as he followed the sound, his eyes scanning the alley for any sign of the person in need. He rounded the corner, and there, lying on the ground, barely conscious, was a man. His clothes were singed, his face streaked with dirt and blood. Greg rushed to his side. "Hey, can you hear me?" he said, shaking the man's shoulder gently. The man blinked a few times before his eyes focused on Greg. I can't move," he muttered, his voice weak. Greg assessed the situation quickly. The fire was too close. The man was injured, and it was clear that he wouldn't be able to get up on his own. But they didn't have much time. "I'm going to get you out of here," Greg said firmly, pulling the man to his feet. "Can you walk?" The man shook his head. "No, I don't think so." Greg's mind raced. He couldn't leave him, not like this. The fire was closing in, and every second counted. "All right," Greg said, lifting the man's arm around his shoulders. "I'm going to help you." We got to move fast. They moved slowly through the alley, the air growing hotter with each passing moment. The flames were spreading quickly, and the wind had picked up, fanning the fire toward them. Every breath was a struggle, the smoke thickening, the heat unbearable. "We're almost there," Greg said, his voice strained. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up, but he wasn't going to leave the man behind. Not when he was so close to the evacuation point. Just as they reached the end of the alley, a massive explosion shook the ground. The blast sent a shock wave through the air, knocking both Greg and the man off their feet. The air exploded in flames, and Greg's vision blurred as he hit the ground hard. He felt the heat wash over him, felt the fire creeping closer. "Get up!" Greg screamed, forcing himself to his feet. He reached for the man, but he was disoriented, his head spinning from the explosion. The fire was too close. They needed to move. The man groaned, barely conscious, and Greg pulled him up again, his heart pounding in his chest. They stumbled toward the evacuation point, but the fire was right behind them now. It wasn't just flames anymore. It was everywhere, surrounding them, closing in. Greg felt his heart race as the flames crept closer. They had to make it, had to keep moving. But as the fire surrounded them, Greg felt an overwhelming wave of hopelessness. And just when he thought they couldn't go any farther, he heard the sound of another vehicle approaching, the rescue team. They were here, the firefighters, the last chance. Greg's heart skipped a beat. He pushed the man toward the vehicle, waving frantically for the team to stop. They could make it. They had to make it. The rescue team pulled up just in time. The flames were so close now, the heat intense as they engulfed the area around them. The fire crackled louder than ever, threatening to swallow everything in its path. But the firefighters were here, and with them came the promise of safety. Greg pushed the injured man forward, barely able to keep his balance as the firestorm raged behind them. The firefighters moved quickly, pulling the man into the back of the truck with urgency. Greg's chest was tight with both exhaustion and relief. They were going to make it. The firefighter captain glanced at Greg as he loaded the man into the vehicle. "We need to move fast. There's no time. The fire's getting worse." Greg nodded, breathless. "I know. Just thank you." The team was already turning to head back toward the safety zone, and Greg followed, the sounds of the fire echoing in his ears. They could feel the heat at their backs, the roar of the flames as it devoured everything they'd once known. But for now, they were safe. They made it back to the evacuation point, where Karen was waiting. Her eyes widened when she saw Greg, relief washing over her. He rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. "You're safe," he said softly, his voice breaking. "It's over. We're going to make it out of here." Karen looked at him, her expression weary but filled with gratitude. "You came back," she whispered. "You didn't leave me." Greg squeezed her hand. "I couldn't leave you. I promised I wouldn't." The evacuation team was still at work, getting people onto buses and trucks, moving them further away from the fire, further away from the destruction. Greg and Karen were ushered into one of the last vehicles, and they rode in silence as the city they once knew became a blur of smoke and flames behind them. As they left the chaos behind, Greg looked at Karen, her face pale but calm. The fire had taken so much from them, from everyone, but they still had each other. They were still alive. The vehicle pulled away from the smoldering wreckage of their homes, the once beautiful neighborhood now reduced to ashes. The future was uncertain. They didn't know what was next or where they would go. But for the first time in a long while, they allowed themselves to take a breath. They had survived, and in that moment, that was enough.